I hate OBS, but in a platonic way. This is my third time recording this video. Let's go over color theory today. What the fuck is color theory? Color theory, a lot of people think it's like what colors look good together. That's what a lot of people refer to color theory as. It isn't. I don't know why people say that it is. That is design theory. Complementary colors, analogous colors. This is design theory. This is not color theory. Color theory is color viewed through the lens of physics as it relates to art. We're going to be referring to color theory here in a digital way. So if you wanted to learn color theory from a traditional perspective, I can go into that too later. It's only slightly different. But color theory from a digital perspective is what we're going to be color theory, we're going to be looking at it from a digital perspective because we are digital people living in a digital world. And by that I mean you're going to be in-betweening in a digital medium and not in a traditional medium because, God forbid. Color theory, in the way that I'm going to be teaching it, can be broken down into three essential components: hue, saturation, and value. Okay, so hue is really easy, and hue is everyone's favorite. Whenever someone asks you, what color is your favorite color, you're probably going to throw out a hue, or a color family as I like to call it. Purple, blue, green. Nobody says that their favorite color is a slightly muted chartreuse unless you're talking to an artist, in which case, good luck. I like to think of hue in terms of color family rather than in individual numeric colors. There are kind of two ways of handling hue, the way that the computer handles it. Which is essentially assigning. So over here, this thing is called the hue strip. I prefer this specific way of working with color. I just think it's dope and awesome, and you can pry it from my cold, dead hands. You might also see this. Some people prefer this. Either way, that's still a hue strip. This thing, the rainbow one, this is hue. That's how you change your hue. Usually I prefer this. Some people prefer the triangle. I don't care. Whatever method you use, whatever works for your brain. There's essentially two different ways of handling hue. There's the way that the computer handles it, and there's the way that our minds handle it. The way that the computer handles it is stupid in terms of art and works for programming. So the way the computer handles it is essentially like each and every single little teeny increment on here is a different hue. That's technically correct, all things considered. These are all different colors, but they don't really look like different colors. Like this right around here, this green kind of looks the same if you're looking at the square up here. It's almost negligible, the difference. Yellow, it's a lot more extreme. Blue, again, right here, this is close to negligible, the difference between these individual hues here. So let's not think about hue in the way that the computer handles it. As technical and cool as that seems, it's not a good way of thinking about it in terms of art. Let's think about hue in the way that our brains handle it, which is through color families. All of these hues right here are in some respect red. This is red, and this is red, and also this is red, and this is red, and this is red. These are all, to our brain, the same hue. They're red. Now, this is a little bit more of a purple red, and this is more of an orange red, and so that's kind of where we get into those minutiae in actual design theory of what colors look better together. You know, do you want to use more of an orange red or more of a pink red? But if you're just throwing out the color red in general, this is all sort of the same-ish. I prefer to break down my hue families a little differently than most people do. I do divide my colors fairly narrowly because I find that it helps conceptualize color differently. But when you generally say the word red, you could be referring from anything from here to here in color to here to here, like all of this is red in some respect. But you're definitely not referring to this unless you're red-green colorblind. But these are considered different color families. So where do we draw the line? Well, personally, I like to draw the line. I will show you where I draw the line. So this is essentially how I think of the color wheel. You'll notice that there's a lot of very intricate color families here, and I prefer to divide, this is generally how I group colors because I feel like it lends to a better understanding of how diverse colors are. For example, you can't really consider all of this to be green because this and this are intensely different hues. Further, I wouldn't really consider necessarily all of this to be in the same color family because these are all very different from each other. They're practically different colors, which is why I divide it the way that I do. Now, you don't necessarily have to divide it exactly this way, and you definitely don't have to use the same names that I do, but do understand that where you kind of start to see the divisions in things is roughly where your color family should be. This is what works for me. This is incredibly subjective, so it won't necessarily work for everyone. In my opinion, getting, like, the right amount of color families is good. Just the standard, like, 7 to 9 color families that we usually think of is not enough, in my opinion. And on top of that, I didn't even consider the colors of, like, brown and lavender and periwinkle, all of the colors that I personally also consider color families that don't occupy 100% saturation. This is only as it relates on the hue wheel. With this considered, all of these colors here occupy the same color family, though they all are pretty different in color. These are all what I would consider to be part of the blood orange family. Now, you might notice some of these are significantly more red or significantly more yellow than the others. That's because the way that I think about color families has less to do with pure divisions in hue and more what we perceive a hue to be. For example, this color here sort of visually looks like a weird off grayish purplish color. Like, it reads kind of purple, at least it does to me. But if you color pick it, you notice it's actually red. This is because of relative colors and how the way that our brain perceives color is not exactly accurate to how wavelengths work or how pure light works. So, for all intents and purposes, when you are thinking about color, you should think about the weird colors like this in two ways simultaneously. The computer considers this to be a red color, and that is the quote-unquote true wavelength or the true hue of that color. However, I perceive this to be a weird off purple color. If you are able to hold both of those ideas in your mind simultaneously, this is a great path to becoming an excellent artist and having an excellent control over your colors. Understanding simultaneously pure quote-unquote true color and relative color is incredibly important to design and to the design theory of color theory. Oh yeah, what was that about saturation? Yeah, this is desaturated, right? That leads us into saturation. There, but that's a good sequitur. So saturation is, again, in computer terms, essentially how turned on a specific strip of light in a pixel is relative to the other strips of light. Right, okay, so in a computer, it consists of 3 strips of light, essentially, like red, green, and blue. These are the 3 strips of light that make up each individual pixel, but they are so incredibly small that you perceive them to be different. If you stick your face up real close to an old TV, you'll actually be able to see the individual red, green, and blue strips of light, and yes, usually they are in that order. And you will see more what I'm talking about. The way that the computer displays colors and displays different colors, just in general, is by controlling basically how turned on the red, green, or blue strips are. For example, if we completely turn off the green and blue strips, the only color that is going to be perceived in that pixel is going to be the color red. So this is how we control that. This, actually, is the reason why red, green, and blue are our primaries in digital. It's not red, yellow, and blue. In pigment, usually red, yellow, and blue are your primary colors. In digital art, red, green, and blue are your primary colors. You can get any color by mixing the wavelengths of red, green, and blue. There's a good physics explanation for this, but I'm not going to get into it. You can find a more detailed video on why, but I'm not really a physics person. I'm an art person, so look into that at your own volition. Two brains in post here. So essentially, there is actually another set of primaries that you might hear come up a couple times in digital art. This is called CMYK. That stands for cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. Black is not really the primary, but cyan, yellow, and magenta are subtractive primaries, which means when you add them all together, you actually get black instead of white. It's usually used for pigments because, you can't really add pigments together and get a brighter color. I don't really know specifically why CMY is used, other than I think it provides a wider range of colors than red, yellow, and blue does. Cyan, yellow, and magenta are actually directly derived from red, green, and blue. Red and green is yellow, red and blue is magenta, and blue and green is cyan. So you might see that come up, but it's not really relevant to purely digital art. That's an aside. I don't want to confuse you too much. Essentially, just remember red, green, and blue are your primaries, because red, green, and blue are the strips of light the pixels are using to determine the colors that are displayed. Oh shit, yeah, the topic was saturation. The ins and outs of what saturation really is in a very digital and physics sense is not something that I fully understand or am willing to explain, because again, it's a very physics topic. But saturation in an art sense is pretty simple. This is saturated red. This is a desaturated red. This is another red, and then here is the exact same color desaturated. Essentially, anything moving towards gray or black or white is going to be more desaturated, because the color is going to be, or the hue is going to be less pure. There's going to be more of, for example, in red, there's going to be more green and blue in this red than there is in this red. I don't know why. That's a physics thing. I'm sure you could probably figure it out, and there's lots of great videos that explain why that is the case, but all you need to know really is that it is the case. The more of the other primaries you add to a primary, the less saturated it becomes. Essentially, the more of the colors complement or direct opposite that you add to a color, the less saturated it's going to be until it hits gray. The color that is in between, like any two complementary colors, is gray. That's how you know they're complementary colors. With primaries, if you add more of the other two primaries to them, the more desaturated it's gonna be. Interestingly enough, with the red, green, and blue primaries, if you're wondering, well, like, okay, if I just add green to red, what color does that make? How do I, what happens when I then add blue to green to red? Well, if you add green and red in digital art, that actually makes yellow. And when you add blue to yellow, that becomes a gray color. Thus, it's complementary. So really, like, any two colors, any two of the primaries, whatever the third one is, that's going to be the complementary. Vice versa, if you have, like, blue, the complementary of blue is going to be whatever red and green makes. Complementary of green is going to be whatever red and blue makes, which is purple, by the way. It's the same in digital art as it is traditionally. And then whatever, green and blue makes, which in this case is cyan, is going to be the opposite of red. That's essentially complementaries in a very in a digital sense. I know that you may have been taught that the complementary of red is green. This is really only true for pigments, and I also don't really even agree with that in pigments. The complementary of red is cyan. Regardless, saturation is, visually speaking, just kind of like how dusty a color looks. If it looks like there's some dust on it, it's desaturated. That's really the best way to think about it in a very practical sense, but hopefully my more in-depth explanation there made some sense. Value is the one that usually everyone starts off with, but I feel like is honestly the most complicated one aside from saturation. Saturation's complicated in a technical sense, but very easy intuitively. Value is not as intuitive as it seems. So value is essentially how light or dark a color is. Value is not the brightness of a color. It's very important that you say value and not brightness, because brightness refers to something else entirely in digital art. A lot of people say that value only really exists in grayscale, and, like, technically speaking, this is true, but value and hue are undoubtedly linked together in a way that A lot of people neglect, at least some traditional artists that I have spoken to tend to neglect the importance of the connection between value and hue, and I will display this in just a moment. Value is, again, like how light or dark your color is. This red has a value that is light in comparison to this red, and this like loosely correlates to brightness. Most of the time it's a pretty like constant correlation. Like this here is brighter than this here. This is considered darker by the computer standards. Oh yeah, by the way, I didn't explain this, but the directions that you can go, it's at least specifically on this color cube, is going right is more saturated, going left is less saturated, or, you know, going towards gray is less saturated. Going up or more towards white is brighter, going towards black or down is usually darker. Anything up here is essentially like the most saturated and the brightest color you can get according to the computer. This is always going to be white, this is always going to be black. This is also always going to be black. For this reason, because there's essentially two corners where it can be black, a lot of people prefer to use the triangle. This is essentially the most saturated you can get, this is the darkest, and this is the brightest you can get. And then value changes wildly in here. Value, again, is not related to brightness and darkness. There's sort of just like a loose tendency towards brightness and darkness, like as it correlates to value. You'll see why in a minute. So why isn't value brightness? I mean, like, hey, I just said that it tends towards brightness, right? And, like, if you get a red here, that's, like, this color, and then you lower the brightness, then the value is darker, right? Like, this is darker than this color. I have eyes. Well, that is true, but brightness is a bit deceptive, especially because this pink here, although it says it has the same brightness as this red, according to the computer, which technically speaking is true, it's actually of a much lighter value than this color is. And if you don't believe me, well, here's a black and white color filter to show you. This black and white color filter really only shows, like, the true value of the colors. And, well, incidentally, here's something interesting. The color wheel appears to actually change in value despite all of the colors on the hue strip being at their most saturated and their brightest. Isn't that interesting? Blue here is very much clearly blue here is very much clearly darker than what I refer to as lilac. Like, that's a huge difference. This is why, essentially, value is not brightness, because these are both colors that are at the same brightness. However, they are drastically different values. This actually is pretty clear when you play with these two colors. If you put the blue in and then you put in a square of lilac, this lilac is so obviously, it looks like a highlight. Like, it's much more, it looks brighter than the blue. It looks more, it has a lighter value, because it does. But incidentally, or interestingly enough, this is actually where value plays into contrast. A lot of people think that if you put two complementary colors together, you're going to get high contrast. This is usually, like, relatively true, just because complementary colors tend to bring out the best in each other. They tend to make the other color look more intense. But it's not always true. What actually lends to high contrast is a large difference in value. Look at that difference in value. That is a huge difference in value. And especially when it comes to character design, and when it comes to designing lighting, and when it comes to framing and stuff, contrast is going to be your best friend. Value is going to be your best friend. You always want to consider the value of a color alongside the hue of a color. Blue is always inherently going to be a darker color than pretty much any other color on the color wheel. I'm sure there's a good physics explanation for it. It probably has something to do with the wavelengths of the color, but, like, I don't really know physics all that well. So this is essentially a good understanding that is relatively advanced. Like, it's not, I'm not lying to you, I'm not dumbing it down for you, but it's not like too intricate. These are the essentially 3 pillars of color theory, and hopefully it makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I don't know how good my explanation was, but hopefully it didn't go too off track. Okay, so to recap, your computer thinks of color differently than your brain does. Your computer sees things in terms of hue, saturation, and brightness, pretty much. Or really, technically speaking, your computer views things in terms of the brightness of RGB values. Your brain perceives things in terms of hue, saturation, and value. Value is special because value is really only perceptible by the human mind. There are occasionally programs that will offer something called an HSV slider, hue, saturation, value slider. This is usually a misnomer because they just interchange either they just interchange the word value with brightness, which is not what value is, or they use a series of algorithms to like loosely approximate the value, and it's not easily measurable. Computers can't perceive value in the way humans can. If you had a sufficiently advanced AI, like maybe you could, but that, I don't know. I feel like it's better just to eyeball it than to try to go to that extent. So value is how light or dark something is, not correlated to brightness, as we just went over. Saturation is essentially how, like, dusty or pure your color is. It is the, I guess, more the purity of the color, but you could also visually sort of see it as the dustiness. That's how I like to think of it. Hue is what color family it's in. Red, orange, yellow, pink, blue, green, whatever. That is hue, saturation, value. So those are essentially the 3 pillars of color theory that are the most important to understanding anything about color theory. That's the language you're going to be using, and that concludes lesson 1. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I hope my explanation was sufficient, and take care.